Andrea Broomfield. I'm a professor of English here at Johnson County Community College, and I see lots of new faces as well as returning faces for the series. I'd like to thank Christy McWard and her wonderful staff here at the CoLab for making these talks possible, along with video production, Susan McSpadden, who always does the photography, and for all those who've helped with the marketing for the great book series, including Maureen Fitzpatrick from the Department of English. We're here today to listen to Dr. Allison Smith, our honored guest. She completed a master's degree in 20th century art history at American University in Washington, D.C., and she did her PhD in Greek and Roman archaeology from the University of Minnesota. She's in her 12th year here at Johnson County Community College and has had many highlights along the way, including work that she's done at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum, studying at the American Academy in Rome, studying at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Greece, and perhaps most exciting of all, doing excavation work in Greece at the Bronze Age Palace and at the Roman Villa in Italy. She's also the recipient of JCCC's most prominent awards, including the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Achievement Award and the Distinguished Service Award. When Allison is not teaching or researching, she's basically researching. She's traveling and she's going to museums. Those are two of her favorite hobbies. Today, Allison is going to be lecturing on a book that has had a monumental impact on her as a young scholar and continues to be a book of great importance. Sarah Pomeroy's Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves. Quite a title. I'm now going to turn it over to Allison.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see everybody. And there are some very expensive seats right up here in the front. One's for Jeanette and one's for Michael Hembry coming in. I've saved you a seat. I'm so happy that so many of you are interested in learning a little bit more about the roles that women played in ancient society. It sounds maybe a little bit like a topic that isn't necessarily my specialty of, maybe more of a historical topic, but it's a topic that we're really informed by visual material. The study of women in ancient societies when women might not have been written about that much, when their names might not have been inscribed across monumental arches and so forth. We can look at pottery and other visual material. There's a couple seats right here in the front. Please don't be shy. Come right in. Anyway, this is the book. If any of you are interested, I know a few of you I bumped into the hall and you've read the book, you have copies of the book, but I just wanted to show you it's a pretty easy read in the sense that it's not huge. It's super interesting in my opinion, and it's a book that had a big impact on me when I first read it. The book was published originally in 1975. And when it came out, it was the first book ever written, first scholarly book ever written on the subject. So Sarah Pomeroy, she's a very well-respected classicist. She has a PhD in classics from Columbia University, and she was a professor of classics for many years before she retired at UT Austin and at Hunter College in New York. So this particular book had a big impact on me when I was studying Greek art. And one of the reasons is because when you look at this visual material, it tells us a little bit about maybe what 50% of the population was doing. When we tend to study ancient history, we focus pretty much on military battles and other events that tend to leave about 50% of the population out. But when we look at visual material, sometimes we get hints as to what everyday women were up to. And Sarah Pomeroy does focus primarily on common women, not necessarily extraordinary women. Maybe you've heard of Sappho, for example. There are a few mentions of women who were married to emperors, for example, but women more like those of us here in the CoLab are the ones who are depicted in the artwork. What do you think, looking at this first vessel, which is an amphora, just a storage vessel, any takers on why I started out with this one for this particular talk?
The seated figure looks as though she might be reading unless she's got an abacus or something.
Yes, excellent, great visual literacy. Art history students have very high levels of visual literacy. It's a good job. Yes, the seated figure here is reading a scroll, which is an ancient version of a book. So that tells us most likely at least some women were literate, right? It's a great way to start out. Sarah Pomeroy focuses, like I said, on the lives of everyday women, ordinary women, and that's what I'm going to try to focus on mainly here today in the next 40 minutes or so. But she starts out very briefly looking at goddesses, looking at the roles of women in mythology. And the reason she does that is because myths obviously help us explain the unexplainable, right? They understanding religious beliefs and the ancient myths kind of helps us tap into the subconscious, so to speak. And so understanding how female gods and goddesses, female goddesses figure into the mythology helps us understand a little bit about what the general attitudes were. I'm going to give you a couple. In my classes, I like to write a couple Greek words of the day on the board. It's kind of fun to see where we learn some of our current interpretations. But the word mythos in Greece, the word for myth, simply meant story. So the understanding of a story was just the way to explain something. In the ancient period, obviously, the term mythos or myth did not imply falsehood. It had no designation of something that was not necessarily true. They obviously believed it. And when you look at some of the goddesses that were represented, there's a strong reference to virginity. For example, here in Artemis, this is the Ephesian Artemis, a very particular representation of the goddess of the hunt in Ephesus. We typically associate Artemis as the goddess of the hunt, but what some folks don't realize is that she was also the protectress of girls and women, and so she also was a helper in childbirth. She was a helper of midwives. So big emphasis on her childbearing capacity there. As far as gods are concerned, you're familiar with Zeus, and Pomeroy tells us there's a pretty big trickle-down effect when you look at the role Zeus played in ancient Greek society. He was a well-known philanderer. There are many vase paintings showing Zeus and his various conquests with mortal women as well as other mythological figures. So that was pretty common, whereas the goddesses themselves were not only faithful to their spouses, but they were virgins. So there's a big difference between Zeus and some of the goddesses. Athena, a goddess you're probably pretty familiar with, another emphasis on that understanding of the role of Zeus and women in ancient Greek society, because she was born right out of the top of Zeus's head. He didn't even need a woman to give birth to Athena. She popped right out of his head, and she was declared the goddess of wisdom, and her ability to maintain that wisdom is because of her birth being right out of the top of Zeus's head. This is something that was well known and still is in Greek culture. This is a stamp from 1974 depicted. So this is something that of course their society is real familiar with. When it's on a stamp, you know it's made it to popular culture. Another mythological representation of women, of course, is the Amazons. And Amazon, that'll be our other Greek word. The word Amazon means amasos, means without breast. They were one-breasted, as you know, and that was so they could aim better with their arrows. They'd get a little bit better shot if they just got rid of one of those, got in the way. But the Amazons were the kind of the pinnacle of everything that is having to do with wild and uncontrolled nature. And Pomeroy explains that the representation of the Amazon in Greek art typically represented that conquest of the uncontrollable. This is one of the most famous depictions of an Amazon with Achilles and the Amazon named Penthesilea, great vase that shows this moment when Achilles conquers Penthesilea, stabs her through the heart, and right at that moment their eyes meet. And he realizes he's in love with her. And it's too late because he's just stabbed her through the heart. Yeah, bummer. Sorry, Achilles. It's on the very shield of Athena. Of course, this is a reconstruction. But in Greek sculpture, for example, on the frieze of the Parthenon, the representations of Greeks are just kind of generic figures. They're not portraits. In the Roman period, we'll see portraits of actual individual Romans, but the Greeks, that would have been considered hubris. So there are no portraits of soldiers, but you will see them fighting Amazons. The Amazons are the stand-in for the enemy, in other words. So it's kind of conquering good versus evil. This is the Parthenon, of course, and the term Parthenon comes from the Greek word, I won't write on the board, but it comes from the Greek word Parthenos, and the word Parthenos means virgin. So this most famous temple that's still standing today, dedicated to Athena the Virgin. Pomeroy starts out super briefly. The book covers roughly about 1,500 years, and she starts out in the Bronze Age. We won't spend an enormous amount of time in the Bronze Age, but it's interesting because it gives you just a little hint at some pretty fundamental changes, at least in Greece, with the roles of women in ancient society. In the Bronze Age, most of the artwork that we're talking about is from the island of Crete, which is the largest of the Cycladic islands in the Aegean Sea. And 85% of the human figures represented in Bronze Age Greek art are female figures. This is where the famous snake goddess comes from. And we'll be referring throughout for the next half an hour on the representation of the snake. It comes back over and over and over again. It starts out as a relatively positive symbol in the Aegean Bronze Age. One of the reasons I wanted to mention this particular society, which was obviously very advanced, very complex civilization, huge palace. This is roughly contemporaneous with the Egyptian New Kingdom. They traded with the Egyptians. There are representations of these folks in Egyptian wall painting as well. But the male figures, that 15% of the human figure that's depicted, they're usually depicted in roles of service, presenting offerings, gestures of respect, and so forth that we see here. One of the reasons, to backtrack a little bit, that Pomeroy starts with this period is not necessarily to single out the roles of women, because this is a prehistoric period and we don't have written documentation, we just have the artwork. But she addresses the importance of the excavator and the archaeologist in interpreting the findings. And what happened with this particular excavation, which was done by a man named Sir Arthur Evans, right around the turn of the century, around 1900 or so, when he unearthed a lot of the material at Crete, he projected his own late 19th, early 20th century British experience on the archaeological record. So our interpretation of the material and the interpretation of the women's roles were different. For example, when he found this seat that he called a throne, this stone seat, he said this must be for the queen, because it has a very, very wide seat on it, and it's for a female who has big hips. It's a pretty small seat, I have to say, but that's actually written in his archaeological documents. And so he kept searching for the man's throne. never found the man's stone. So we went back and said, well, we originally thought this was for the queen, but since we never found a second seed, it must be for the king. And the rest of the documentation for this particular site was interpreted based around this archaeological evidence that they found. Although there's plenty of material that documents female figures seated with male figures walking up to them with offerings. So the current interpretation has changed quite a bit. It's been excavated pretty extensively. The frescoes, this is from a satellite island right nearby that was thought to be under control from the palace at Knossos. Most of the images were nature related, and then the mainland takes over, the island of Crete, and the depiction of the human figure changes pretty significantly, and we have more representations of warfare and a greater number of male figures. Talking a little bit about now moving into Homer and the Dark Ages, Pomeroy talks about Helen and the role Helen of Troy played. Helen originally is from Sparta, and she was taken to Troy and caused the Trojan War. So who can tell me why? How did Helen cause the Trojan War? What did she do to cause this battle that's gone down in the history of great literature? English people can...
Well, she was a married woman.
Yes.
And she fell in love or was captured and kidnapped by Paris, who was a prince of Troy.
Right.
So he took her back, and he took all her married goods too. So in the Iliad, for instance, they keep repeating, "You got to get Helen and all her stuff and take her back."
Right. That's right. So Helen, she committed the very, very serious crime of being very, very beautiful. And Paris was given Helen as a gift, and because he was awarded the most beautiful woman in the world, and that was Helen. So Helen was taken to Troy, and her husband, who was back home in Sparta, was a little annoyed by this, as you might imagine. So that's what starts the Trojan War. But in the Greeks' mind, it really was Helen who started the Trojan War. And again, this is on a stamp from 1983. The abduction of Helen. So kind of segueing into marriage and family life, the depiction of marriage on Greek vessels is pretty prominent. We have a lot of references to marriage, and the visual depiction of marriage is the male figure clasping usually the wrist. In this rare instance, it's the hand, but almost always you'll see it clasping the wrist. So the woman extends her hand and the man clasps it, and that's the icon or the visual symbol for marriage. And either marriage by abduction or capture was well known throughout Greece and depicted on a number of vessels. Probably the most famous wife in Greek art and literature is Penelope, the wife of Odysseus in the Odyssey. And Penelope is such a great role model for all Greek women because she's faithful to her husband even though he's gone for 20 years. And and she has all of these suitors who come relentlessly to her house. But she comes up with this ploy that many of you probably know. She is weaving. She's weaving a shroud, and she says, "I'll pick one of you suitors when I'm finished weaving." Well, she never finishes weaving because at the end of the day, she undoes all of her weaving and then she starts back over again. So this is a way to never finish. So Penelope, it's interesting because she's able simultaneously to convey the good wife persona, that she's faithful, but she is also deceptive. So you have to be careful because even good, faithful wives can be deceiving. So she kind of has that double entendre there. Weaving is something that we know a little bit about in ancient society. I brought in another book just in case folks are interested. This is another book that I loved, but I didn't think it'd make for a very interesting talk, but women's work the first 20,000 years, and it's on textile production in antiquity. It's really fascinating, and this exact work actually is on the cover. But this is something that was a huge part of women's lives in antiquity. They are expected to do all of the weaving in the home. And it played an important role not only in their domestic life, but also in their religious life. This is on the Parthenon itself, and it is what's called a peplos, or the garment that would have been woven every 4 years, and then they would have had a giant parade, basically, through Athens up to the Parthenon to give it to the statue of Athena. So, and the weaving would have been done by prominent young socialite girls. So it had a big importance in women's lives for a number of different reasons. Also, I should mention too that Athena herself got into a little weaving contest with a mortal woman named Arachne. And Athena won, Arachne won. Arachne won, and Athena said, well, if you're going to beat me, Arachne, I'm just going to make you weave 24 hours a day for the rest of all eternity, and turned her into a spider. And so that's how we have that contemporary association sometimes of women with spiders. But this is a loom, a super cool loom, and I brought in a weaving. I have a few little show and tell items. This is something that I got in Turkey. It's all dyed with natural dyes, believe it or not, these vibrant colors. It's just amazing, and it's goat hair, so it's real similar to something the ancient Greeks would have done. But I wanted you to see the bottom of it, if you can see that with the ends. Oh, thank you, Jeanette. But this is just a little hint. So when you're looking at the loom there, one of the cool things, if you go on a Roman excavation or Greek, when you walk into a domestic structure, you can always tell exactly where the woman was weaving. Why is that, Rachel? You can't answer. Anybody have any guesses? Because the loom, which was wood, and then the fiber, which is a natural material, all would disintegrate over hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. But what doesn't disintegrate are the clay loom weights. So when you're excavating a house, you'll just find a row of loom weights, all perfectly in a row, where they just fell off and stayed preserved forevermore. Clay is just the most fabulous material because it lasts forever. So you can always date something or identify a particular room by clay. Here's pretty much a basic floor plan of the domestic house, what they call the oikos in ancient Greek society. And you can see the andron is the man's room. They have their own separate entrance, totally separate. The sexes would have been kept totally separate. And Pomeroy makes the point. She says, well, that wouldn't be very fun. Why would why would the ancient Greeks want to be totally separate from their spouse? No, pretty much no interaction whatsoever. Why would that be? Any guesses? No guesses? Because we want to be with our spouses for the most part, right?
That's what I was thinking, the odd mistresses.
Well, they did. Greek men wouldn't marry till at least they were 30 years old. So their only real physical relationships would have been with prostitutes, because there was no interaction at all, no dating or anything like that. And you couldn't possibly marry a friend of yours, because girls were married at the age of 12 to 15. So there wasn't really that sense of companionship that we have today, because there's such a huge age difference. And with the age difference also comes education differences. Supposedly young girls were educated to a certain degree in the home, but you can imagine a pretty disparate intellectual ability between a 12 or 14-year-old and a 30-year-old who would continue his education when a younger girl would have been caring for the children or weaving and some of her other chores. But this is basically a model of a Greek house, and Pomeroy makes a real important point, draws a pretty big distinction between the daily activity of an ancient Greek woman versus someone who would have access to the beautiful, glorious buildings that we come to associate with ancient Greece. In Athens in particular, we're going to talk about a couple other cities where it was very different, but in Athens, proper Athenian citizen women would not leave the house at all. There would be no going to the market. There would really be no reason to leave the house at all except for 1 or 2 festivals a year. Slaves were sent to fetch water at the public fountains, and slaves could be anyone from a neighboring town that would, if they were engaged in a battle, say, you know, I usually explain to my students, and these battles were common, so say, you know, Overland Park and Olathe get in a battle. You know, all the men of Olathe, if Overland Park wins, all the men of Olathe could be killed, and all the women of Olathe would be brought back to be the slaves and the housekeepers. And those would be the folks from Olathe would be the ones fetching the water. Sorry if you're from Olathe. But the fountains themselves were written about pretty extensively. Those were common places where it could be a little bit dangerous for a woman to go. As far as sexuality is concerned and physical relationships, we do have documentation of flirtatious behavior, but the fines were pretty serious. If a man flirted with a married woman, the married man had permission to kill the man, and the woman would be sold into slavery. The penalties for rape were much less than a male would have been fined. We do have interaction between the sexes at symposia, which would be events held in the andron or in solely in male company, and prostitutes would come and entertain and so forth. As far as relationships for women, we don't have any evidence in Athens anyway of any type of homosexual relationships among women, but we do in both Sparta and Lesbos. And in Sparta and Lesbos, Pomeroy outlines that young girls were educated in a community setting, and so there would have been more opportunity to make friends and to meet women outside of your immediate family. And in Athens, you pretty much only interacted with women from your particular family. Another example there. This is Aspasia, who is probably one of the most prominent of the Greek, you might call her a consort or one of the Hetairai. It's debated. We don't know for certain if she was, but she came from Miletus and was very highly educated and was the lover of Pericles, the great Athenian leader Pericles. And apparently she was very intelligent, and her company was very highly sought after. The Hetairai had great freedom of movement. Those would have been prostitutes at the very, very highest level who were greatly admired not only for their beauty but also for their intellectual abilities, and they would have had freedom of movement. So that kind of makes us wonder about the health of women. In Athens, we know that women were not quite as healthy as in other cities, since they didn't get outside and didn't have the opportunity to exercise and have that kind of emotional connection with others and so forth. We know that there were many more offerings to the healing god Asclepius made by women. You can see various body parts here. If you had, say, a foot problem or a leg problem, this is what you would donate to the god Asclepius. And you can see all the various different body parts, different sexes who are asking for the healing god to help out. I have a couple of kind of funny quotes here I wanted to read to you as far as childbirth is concerned. And this is from Hippocrates' aphorisms. This is what he says. To determine whether a woman is pregnant, give her a drink of hydromel, which is like a mead, it's like fermented honey. Give her a drink of hydromel. If she suffers from colic in the stomach, she's pregnant. If she doesn't suffer from colic, she's not pregnant. A pregnant woman has a good complexion if the child is male, a poor complexion if the child is female. A male fetus leans to the right, a female to the left. So obviously, you know, they were very advanced in many ways, but this probably wouldn't be one of them. We do know that they gave birth seated, probably on a birthing stool. Now moving to Sparta, Sparta was totally different than Athens in many, many ways. Spartan girls were encouraged to marry at 18 instead of at 12 or 14, and the reason for that is they thought they would be physically stronger and better able to give birth and raise children. We know that Spartan girls exercised alongside of men. We even have written record that they participated in chariot races in the same areas as men did. They competed in athletic games. We also know that they were as well nourished. The documents say that Spartan girls were as well nourished as boys. In Athens, for example, not only were women given less rations, but a woman who had just given birth to a baby boy was given twice as much food than a woman who was given birth to a baby girl. So that even kind of trickled down, so to speak, to nursing and raising the infants. This is a painting by Degas because I had to tap into my other sphere of interest with 19th century painting. But the reason I'm showing you this is because he must have read Xenophon's commentary on the Spartan girls. They probably were not topless. This is, 19th century painting interpretation. But ancient Greek written records tell us that a common way to refer to Spartan girls was that the dress that they wore was called thigh showers. Thigh showers. The Athenian women would not have shown their bare thigh. Apparently this would have made it easier for them to walk around, of course. Another town, Gortyn, the Gortyn Law Code. Gortyn is on the island of Crete where we saw the snake goddess. And in this inscription, just like in Sparta, we do know that women were able to inherit property and they were able to control their own property. If they got divorced, they would take 50% of their goods with them. The goods that they produced, their weavings, for example, whatever they produced, they would take with them. So we have written record of this at Sparta and at Gortyn. So it seems like Athens is really the only city where women wouldn't have full property rights. Turning briefly to religious activity, this is pretty important because this is really the only public realm that women participated in. And this is the site at Delphi, beautiful, beautiful site at Delphi, where the folks at Delphi, they thought, the Greeks in general, thought that Delphi was the center of the world. They thought it was the navel of the world. This is a word I always have to give my students because you never know when you might need this word. I hope you all can see it. Omphalos. This is a sculpture of an omphalos, and that basically means belly button. It's clearly an outie, but they thought that Delphi was the navel of the world, and they have the sculpture of the navel, and it would have been draped with a weaving, and so it was permanently draped with a sculptural version of a weaving. This is where this is the Temple of Apollo, what's left of the Temple of Apollo, and right next to the Temple of Apollo would sit the Pythia. The Pythia is the priestess who would interpret, well, a male priest interpreted her kind of nonsensical rantings. I know that's a shocker. But the Pythia is the one who would sit and give forth some oracle. So this is an example you might be familiar with, is when a famous general comes to the Pythia. She breathes in the vapors, and there actually were vapors from a cleft in a rock here at Delphi. She would breathe in these vapors, she'd go into a trance, and she'd mumble something. And then the priest would translate it. And the question that was posed to her was, should I go to battle? And she says, if you go to battle, you will destroy a great army. So what happens? The general goes off to battle. She said, the Pythia said, I would destroy a great army. It was his army. so you had to have a special gift to interpret her oracle, but nonetheless, this is important because we see how this figure is looked at by all Greek society. People from all over Greece would come here to Delphi. They had athletic games like the Olympic Games held here, the Delphic Athletic Games, and people would want to seek her counsel, well-respected people in ancient history. So we have a female figure capable of bestowing this information, but they needed a male to interpret her rantings, which were, not intelligible. You might have noticed her name Pythia, P-Y-T-H-I-A, associated with Python or snake figure. Lots of references to the snake figure. Apollo, in order to take control of Delphi, had to slay the serpent. So once Apollo slayed the serpent, which again is the symbol of irrationality and kind of uncontrolled nature, then he could take over. One of the Greek festivals that women were encouraged and allowed to participate in was the festival known as the Thesmophoria. It was a festival in honor of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. It was an agrarian festival in the autumn with the sowing of seeds. And women, Athenian citizen women, men were not allowed to participate. Athenian citizen women would spend 3 days out in the country, and they would make these offerings of baby piglets to a cave that were supposedly eaten by the snake that lived in the cave. And that was that offering to have a good harvest. The word piglet in Greek, koiros, was the slang term that was used for females' private parts. Not a nice word to use, but that's the same word for piglet. Another festival that women participated in was a festival in celebration of Dionysus. And Dionysus is the god of wine. I think we have a few people in this room who still celebrate that festival. Rosalie, maybe? That's my mom, I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, she likes wine, as many of us do. And the women associated with the followers of Dionysus, they're called Maenads or mad women. And in Euripides' play, The Bacchae, he explains that these women would walk around with snakes wrapped around their shoulders, and the snakes would lick their cheeks. So many references to the snake. This is a festival that's very, very different from the Thesmophoria. The Thesmophoria is a festival women participated in to contribute to society, to help the growing of crops. And the Dionysiac festivals were something that they allowed them to rebel against society. Another Maenad there. Turning briefly to Rome, I'm almost done. You guys are being a great audience. This is it's a lot of information, so thanks for sticking with me. 2/3 of the book is on Greek women. The last third of it is on Roman women. So I'll wrap up with a brief look at what Roman women were up to. Totally different scenario. We know that women were educated in Rome. There's a written record of a little girl named Virginia who would go to school in the Roman Forum. We know that there were athletes. This is a mosaic, a floor mosaic actually, in the Piazza Armerina in Sicily, so we can see them using their little hand weights. It was encouraged for Roman women and for Spartan women to exercise, because if you exercised and you were in good physical shape, you could produce better children and care for your children and so forth. So education and physical strength was something the Romans encouraged. They also encouraged childbirth. And women saw really probably more freedom of movement than we had seen in antiquity with Augustus, the first Roman Emperor Augustus. This is the famous Areopagus, or altar of Augustan peace, and pretty much the entire thing is dedicated to fertility and the importance of childbearing. Here in these natural forms, just with insects and plants, and it's just this wonderful fecund relief sculpture. It's just beautiful. This is just one of the most beautiful works of art on the planet, in my opinion. But then we also have Mother Earth, or Tellus Italiae, here almost simultaneously nursing 2 babies. So again, just this wonderful kind of peaceable kingdom here. This altar, by the way, I skipped right over that, was dedicated on January 30th, which was Augustus's wife's birthday. It's very nice of him, right? Livia is Augustus's wife, and that's when the work was kind of the ribbon cutting, I guess you could say. On the relief sculpture that winds around the Areopagus, for the first time, we have representations of women and children on this state relief. That's how valued motherhood was. And in Roman law, women were allowed to divorce. They were allowed to take their property with them. In fact, there was a law that said men were only allowed to give away up to 50% of their property. They only owned 50% of their property, and the other 50% was belonged to the wife. So they couldn't touch the other 50%. It still, though, was common that all women in Greece and in Rome had what was called a guardian. That's the person, that's kind of their legal guardian, was a male figure in their life, a father, husband, brother, or even son, if the others had been deceased. And if a woman gave birth to 3 children, she was allowed to ditch her guardian. She did not have to have a guardian anymore. So that was a way to kind of work your way up by having 3 children. I'd do it, wouldn't you? You wouldn't know. Some are like, no. Really quickly, looking at Pompeii, which is just such a fun way to really get a great glimpse into the lives of men and women in ancient Roman society. We know that whereas, say, in ancient Greece, you wouldn't see women in the workplace serving food, for example. It would have been very, very rare. In the marketplace, you would have seen extremely poor women, slaves, elderly, and so forth, selling goods. But in Pompeii, it would have been very common for women to work in these taverns. This is basically kind of like just like a tavern, like a bar where you could go and get bread and wine or beer. And there's tons of graffiti in Pompeii. One of these written texts was written by a man whose friend, this is a quote from the graffiti, his friend loves the tavern maid whose name is Iris, but she really doesn't care about him. So, it was common to go down to the tavern, meet a young woman and chat a little bit. We have a lot of the houses, the storefronts. It's really like walking through a ghost town. Super cool experience. If you haven't been to Pompeii, go. This is a street, by the way. Super cool. This is what the forum would have looked like. And we know that women would have gone to the forum and interacted there. And one of the most important building owners in the Pompeii Forum was a woman. Oh, here, this is what it looks like now. It was a woman named Eumachia. She apparently owned a large textile industry in the forum there. This is it. This is what's left of her building. And there was a statue dedicated to her and inscribed with kind of like a thank you note from the textile workers. So we know that certain Roman women had important roles as business owners. We also know that they were literate because of these beautifully preserved frescoes from Pompeii in the Naples Museum. She is actually holding what would be like a pen. It's a stylus, and she would have written on this tablet, kind of inscribed into like a wax tablet. And he's holding a book. That's our version of a book, a little scroll. Another prominent woman from a Roman town in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, is Plancha, who apparently was an orator, a great orator. She also is credited with founding this city. So she also rose to pretty great prominence. And this is a portrait of her. So, to sum up, we've seen goddesses, whores, wives, and slaves, and athletes. Sarah Pomeroy discusses all of them in much greater detail than I had time for in 45 minutes, but I hope I've given you just a little glimpse into some of the roles these women had in ancient society, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Why would a virgin have so many breasts?
That is a very good question. And these little nodules on the outside of the sculpture, they have been interpreted a number of different ways. There are some scholars who say they're breasts. There are some who say they are eggs.
What made the difference in the societies of the women to be oppressed or not oppressed? You know, like you have Pompeii where, you know, you have someone who owns a business, but then you go to Athens and they're not even allowed out of the house. What was going on economically, or was there factors of that nature going on, or was it just...
Well, some of the philosophers at the time actually said that the reason for Sparta's downfall was because of the liberty that women had, that was actually the reason the city fell. It was because of the women. They were looked at more as kind of an uncontrolled, irrational force. In fact, you might have noticed the roots of the word hysteria and hysterectomy are the same, because that would have been a way to remove the hysteria from a woman. So there was something innate, it was believed. There was just something innate that could cause kind of like almost like a cancer in a community. And that desire, I think, for us to control the uncontrollable.
Well, there's also the difference between the Etruscans and the Romans. And the
Yes.
Etruscans became the Romans, essentially. But one, I don't remember which general it was, when he came down off the mountain and was looking over Rome, it was talking to his Etruscan friend, and he said, you know, the difference between Roman women and Etruscan women are, Etruscan woman's out having a party with all the other males around in the town.
Yeah.
But my Roman wife is at home.
Yeah. That was probably one of the biggest insults you could say to a Greek woman, was that she was acting like an Etruscan. And I didn't talk about the Etruscans, not because I didn't want to, but I was afraid I wouldn't have enough time, and I might not have. But the Etruscans were pre-Romans. They lived on the peninsula of Italy before the Roman Empire. And they lived during the period of classical Athens. And of course, the folks from classical Athens traveled, and they were familiar with the freedom that Etruscan women had in Italy, what we know of as Italy today. And they went home and were shocked by this and upset. It's hard to say exactly what contributes to that. I might have to turn that over to Professor Hembry, who's a European historian. But we see that a lot, don't we, Michael, in European history, that certain periods of time, say the medieval period, women had a little bit more greater freedom of movement. When the constraints in the rules of society get a little bit loosened, then we have a little bit more freedom of movement from kind of the lower members of society. And Greece, or Athens anyway, was so structured, so many rules, and that's part of what made it great, but it also was really restrictive for 50% of the folks.
Romans could have been influenced by the Etruscans
Mm-hmm.
in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
Including gender relations.
Yes, he says the Romans could have taken their influence from the Etruscans, who were there first.